All right. I just checked. We are live on Twitter, and I believe we'll be live on YouTube as well. So this is a good. Although Twitter doesn't, I need to have the login to change the. It just says "Welcome to our live show," which I guess is just fine. And I'm going to just do something weird to make sure. Yes, there is definitely video on Twitter and on YouTube. So that will be great. I think afterwards we'll have to title it for the future's sake. I don't know if anyone's watching, but my assumption is that afterwards you'll be able to hit play and watch it if it's on Twitter or X and YouTube. So I think we're good. Welcome, Joseph Thomas Minnick. Is your middle name Thomas?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I inherited that from my biological father. Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, who was a twin. I don't think
Right.
they knew that Thomas meant twin when he was named Thomas, but I inherited the middle name. Yeah.
So the disciple or apostle of Jesus named Thomas, it's probably not his name. It's probably a title.
I believe that's theorized. I don't know if it's a proper. It might be a title turned into a proper name. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Well, it's distinguished him because it looks like if you look in the Syrian tradition, his name's actually Judas, and likely later in life you like just like the Epistle of Jude is actually the Epistle of Judas. You probably don't want to sound like your name is Judas, given Judas the betrayer.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So Thomas is probably a title because in the first century, as far as if I'm correct on this, there's no like extant evidence that Thomas or Didymus means it is a name. It actually starts as a title, so it's like a nickname.
Oh, interesting.
So it's possible his name is Judas.
Oh, okay. Oh,
Judas
fascinating.
Thomas.
Yeah.
So
I inherited it way after everybody forgot all that stuff.
yeah, and I'm not insinuating that you're a Judas betrayer, by the way, but
Oh no, that's okay.
the actual topic that we were hoping to talk through was the question of wisdom. This is our kind of our first Davenet live stream. We're going to try to do this every single week. We originally were going to talk about Boethius and wisdom, and we probably will do that tomorrow. Today, if you're listening, this is more just of a test run to see how the technology works, if it's easy to stream and communicate, and how the titling works, whereas hopefully starting tomorrow, we'll do a weekly live stream. And I think our thought was basically to look at something going on currently, that's why the live stream, and then to discuss it, thinking through, as much as we're able, how wisdom can help us analyze, think through it, and all that kind of stuff. And one thing that, I don't know if you watched it, but I was watching my friend Wes Huff recently on Joe Rogan. Wes Huff's finishing his PhD at U of T and has done, but it's taken him a while because he's done years of research and work with Apologetics Canada. And it was a fun podcast to watch. And it made me reflect on how we live in a world where learning is for as a Christian is almost no longer optional. Like you need to know your stuff. You need to know what things are. My neighbors are primarily, like my literal neighbors, are primarily Hindu and Muslim. And if I don't have a way to talk about the hypostatic union or a way to talk about three hypostases in the one God, there's almost no way we can have gospel talk, because those are the key dividing issues and matters that kind of distinguish Christianity from everyone else. So, well, it's not exactly like wisdom. I just reflecting on how I think wise and winsome Wes was in his podcast, how much he knew, how much he prepared, how he was able to communicate that, and it made me realize just how important it is to learn today. So I know you do a lot of stuff with pastors. In fact, is it next week you're doing the pastors?
The Lily cohort is this coming Tuesday. Yep. We'll have
and I know you teach on all this kind of stuff. So maybe just like maybe give the smart guy version about what wisdom is and why we need it for life.
I don't know if I can accomplish all that. It's funny you mentioned this. Actually, my oldest son listens to. I don't think I've ever listened to a whole Joe Rogan, and that's not a boast. I just happen. I'm just,
not a boast.
I make more podcasts than I just don't. I've never got into the genre really. But it was actually my oldest son who he sent me I think he sent me a message just the other day, and he was like, "Hey, Dad, it looks like an actual Christian went on Joe Rogan." And I, was able to say like, oh, well, that's funny. I think Wyatt, my good buddy Wyatt knows that guy. And I did listen to just some of the clips, and one of the things that perhaps puts what you're saying in refrain. I think the clip I've seen float around is mostly him responding to and evaluating the role of Jordan Peterson.
Jordan Peterson, yeah.
And it's an interesting point because in a nihilistic culture, or a culture, even if we don't want to use that word, in a culture that's kind of numb to the structure of meaning, if you could put it that way, there's this question out there about what do we need to kind of rediscover that the world's actually alive, rediscover, as it were, the deep meaning of things, to get outside of kind of cultural malaise or whatever, that sort of thing. And presumably Christianity in the light of Revelation and the gospel has something to do with that. And yet somebody like Jordan Peterson has come along and even for Christians has given this kind of degree of orientation to a lot of extent. And so one of the questions becomes how is that like proto-evangelium? How much of the gospel is that? Are we going to get to a point where if somebody like Jordan Peterson, I don't want to make this a turf war, but like if it's Jordan Peterson that is communicating meaning to people and that sort of thing, are we going to lose, and without remainder, you might say, communicating meaning in a way that the pastor is not? Are we going to are we going to lose a certain kind of public truth credibility? And this is really getting to your point about knowing your stuff. It really, the world of, the rhetorical world out there is very complicated. There's a lot of people on the stool saying, here is the path back to meaning. And there's actually insight in a lot of them. And yet it's, in one sense, we're also in a sea of noise. There's also, other religions you're talking about with your neighbors and such. And I think this is really just me saying, I think you're absolutely right, that we need to know our stuff. I suppose one way I'd wonder about that formula, though, is there a way, what would wisdom look like? You and me can read a bunch of theology books and learn a lot about the hypostatic union and that sort of thing. And even if we want other believers to really know their stuff in as much as possible, I do think there is also a way to speak about an orientation for the not super learned, even talking to the normal Muslim or the Hindu as well. And I think we'd want to preserve some grammar of wisdom, even or say that there's an ability to be wise, that God can kind of give you what to say enough, even if you don't quite possess the distinctions. But the church as a sort of hive mind needs to grow very deeply and theologically.
Yeah, I think that's right. It strikes me that theology has always been public and political to some degree.
Yeah.
And there may have been a time in our kind of recent history where they didn't feel real because there were some baseline assumptions that everyone kind of agreed upon. But as things change, it seems like those assumptions are no longer agreed upon. So we live in a world in which you genuinely need to live by wisdom. You need to think carefully about the world and reality, the differences. Like I said, just because the particular location that I live in, I am quite literally surrounded by both polytheists and those who are strict monotheists, and a Trinitarian faith like Christianity. Right. I'm sort of the oddball in my local place that I am right now, and so it's like that is intensely public. Like, one of the things I think that a lot of people maybe in our circles didn't fully realize is how often religious people, whether they are, immigrants or whether they are highly Hindu or highly Muslim, will talk about faith. Like, it's not something that is unusual for me. I remember I was at a bus stop waiting for a child of mine, and there was another father there, and I was talking to him. He was a Muslim legal scholar. And so there's like just no way we're not talking about religion immediately. So the idea of, someone like a Jordan Peterson or like a Wes Huff doing sort of a pre-evangelism or whatever you want to call it, it's like, yeah, kind of. Like we don't even know how to speak the same language today in our world. So there is something we need to reclaim there. And we also need to know the grammar. I don't know, you were talking about the grammar, but like the grammar of wisdom, the grammar of reality, the grammar of being just by justice, being wise by wisdom. The grammar of, actually we'll talk about this tomorrow, the grammar that actually Boethius in his Consolation of Philosophy, so clearly articulates when it comes to seeking the good and happiness and all that. Like, we need language to talk to people so that there's like almost like a common. It's almost like we need to like reform common sense so that we can have common conversations, which in turn will give us opportunity, I think, to proclaim gospel and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, one of the questions I think that's of deep perennial significance right now, maybe that's the wrong word to use, but is whether in our I was talking about that disorientation from nature, and in one sense, I wasn't even trying to put Peterson and Huff next to each other. In one sense, the reason you need wisdom is to be able to distinguish them. A lot of people in America might listen to the guy you mentioned and then Jordan Peterson and say, well, what's the difference? They're both kind of religiously oriented. And it takes knowledge to even pick up what he's saying, as opposed to, like, a lot of people are going to hear him distinguishing himself from Jordan Peterson. And even that takes a little bit of knowledge to grasp what he was saying. Sorry, I went off on a tangent there. The last thing you said, I'm sorry, Wyatt.
Well, sorry, I got distracted. So we're this is our kind of our test run of this technology, but it looks like the there's we're using actually shows the chat that is happening from YouTube and X. So I just find that interesting.
Yep. Oh, beautiful.
If you are listening to this is our kind of our test run of this technology.
Yes.
We're planning to do a weekly live stream based on some contemporary issue, then we'll try to respond by, thinking about it somewhat deeply in the sense of two or three friends talking over a live stream. So we'll see how that actually pans out in reality. Yeah, I do think there is. I mean, so I do teach. You do as well, philosophy. But one of the things that has been really important to me. I mentioned this before we recorded, is that just the idea of wisdom has almost been an existential crisis for me for most of my life, because I grew up in an environment where I was almost not. It's almost like if it was not a Bible verse, it couldn't be true. And yet so many of the questions that I faced didn't have a direct Bible verse. So, for example, like Jeremiah 31 is super helpful to understand the new covenant, but it's difficult to understand, which career choice I should make, or should I start a business and be a lifeguard? When I was 16, I started a business and was a lifeguard and did something else. And is this really the wise course of action? And it really wasn't until, I don't know, maybe in my 20s, when I finally was freed up to live in the world that Proverbs and Ecclesiastes describes. Because I think 90% or more of life is Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. Like, if you go to work every day from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. and you are, commuting and working in a workplace, most of what you do is Ecclesiastes and Proverbs.
Yeah.
And to have the resources to understand, live, and seek success. Again, I know we're supposed to talk about Boethius, but we delayed it till tomorrow, so we're doing our test and our kind of real run tomorrow.
Yeah.
This has been I'm working through this with my friend Matthew Hoskin right now, and he's obviously was he a fellow of the Daven Institute?
He's one of our dear homies. Yeah.
Yeah, he's teaching a course. I can't remember what he's teaching this semester, but yeah, you should sign up for that. He's brilliant.
Right.
But on Boethius, and as I reread this, it's kind of blowing me away, not because he's necessarily citing Bible verses, although, of course, he knows the Bible very well, but because he's lived such a, he's a political leader, he's a key thinker, he's a philosopher, and he's a Christian, but he so understands the world of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes that he almost frees you to live well and successfully and to know what it means to pursue happiness. I'll say one more thing, I'll give it right back to you. I'm reading the Odyssey right now, which is gripping, but the pursuit of happiness in that book and its eventual end, which is essentially a father and son get together and have a bonding time by slaughtering their enemies graphically. There's something about these two visions of the wise and happy life, because happiness is a key to both Boethius and the Odyssey, but they're very different in how happiness is achieved. One is through, I haven't finished the Odyssey yet, so I'm speaking a little bit beyond my knowledge, but from what I can see so far, there's vengeance seems to be a big part of happiness in one book, and then Boethius, of course, is vindicated by understanding wisdom and the causes of providence and God and so on.
The one of the books I teach for Davenant is called Philosophy as a Way of Life.
Kind of a history
by Ado? Yeah. Yes, and it kind of philosophy as a way of life, and I think the it's a yes.
I have it somewhere. I'm looking for it, but I know exactly.
Sharp and Urey, I think, are the names of the authors, and they. But in any case, Boethius is mentioned in the again, it's doing a kind of a history of philosophy as a way of life. But Boethius is looked at as kind of, and maybe we'll talk about this a little more tomorrow, but sort of the last of the classical philosophers, kind of the end of classical philosophy, and sort of anticipating in its very end. It ends with a call to prayer and hope. One thing I'd say, I know this is just a test run, and so we're not necessarily going to get to everything here, but on the broader subject of the recovery of wisdom, I think one of the real things that's going to be a question and something almost, I don't want to say to be taxonomized, but again, going back to kind of that sense that we don't feel connected to reality, that there's some loss of its gravitational pull on us. One of the questions in the recovery of wisdom becomes, do you need to get nature back in order for the gospel and the Bible and grace to make sense? Do the colors of creation shine for the colors of the gospel to make sense? Or do nature and grace, if you will, reorientation to both nature and grace, do those come simultaneously? Can it be that can it be the case that actually you discover nature by discovering its redemption? And so I think here of like the way Lewis writes in That Hideous Strength, it's largely structured around Mark and Jane, who are disoriented from their gendered natures, but their reorientation to their gendered nature and their conversion to Christ are not really that they're dialectically in one moment for them. They kind of the whole of reality comes in one fell swoop to them, which is not to say that it doesn't happen the other way for others.
Right.
Maybe there are some people that they discover natural law and there's meaning there, but there's limits and the gospel comes in or whatever. But I think it's an interesting thing to look for because, is reorientation kind of getting the pagan virtues back so we can re-Christianize, or is it a whole package? It's actually, I just think that's an interesting question in the acquisition of wisdom.
Yeah, I think so. The nature grace thing's obviously a sort of landmine in the history of Christian theology and thought. Sorry, my brain is so lost. So I want to go back to one thing, then I want to get to what you just said. I think it's really important. And I think we should spend a whole live stream, by the way, on the question of gendered nature or sex in general. I think that would be absolutely fascinating. I have, is it J. Bud, what's his name again? J. Bud is what everyone calls him.
The Austin guy.
Yeah, the Austin guy.
Yeah.
I don't even want to try to pronounce his name right now. He has some brilliant things. Edith Stein as well has some things, and also her husband died in World War II. He was a German kind of Nazi resistor, and she wrote a book called The Privilege of Being Alice von Hildebrand. Yep. There's some really brilliant things on gendered nature and sex in general. I think that'd be something we should talk about, so we should note that down. But there's a book by Pierre Hadot called Philosophy as a Way of Life. Is that the book you were talking about? Okay, good. Sorry, I thought Hadot is kind of the guru of that whole theme, and then this is the book kind of summarizing all the scholarships in Hadot. Oh, okay, that's what I was trying to. I was like, we're talking about the same thing. The nature of grace thing is really interesting. We have all these different definitions. You even have like this new kind of neo-Calvinist definition where grace restores nature even.
Yeah.
Whereas a more Thomistic view would be grace perfects in the sense of bringing nature to its intended end. And then you have some, like I would say probably the way I grew up is the way that many grew up, where nature and grace are almost two separate things.
Yeah.
Where grace is kind of what you do on Sunday, then nature is what you do in your work week.
Yeah.
And they don't tie together. I do think increasingly that's sort of a luxury of the end of whatever you want to say, the Christian consensus of culture.
Yeah.
It's a luxury to believe that way. It's no longer possible. You can't go to work and not be a Christian. However you want to make that distinct, I don't necessarily think we want to articulate how that fits together on a live stream when I didn't pre-think about it. But I would say that there's something really important to going to work. Yes, you live in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, but you're also a Christian. Because at the end of Ecclesiastes, Shlomo says, the end of all things is fear God and obey his commands. So, yeah, there is a certain sort of wisdom that is necessary to live in the vanity of life, but behind it all is this sort of command or will of God that must be followed.
Yeah, we're talking about wisdom, and I'm fascinated by the notion that the New Testament calls Christ our wisdom. And I think this is the other sense in which I'd always say, like, even if the Christian church part of the goal of the Davenant Institute, of course, is to help the Christian church in America on the knowledge front, on the retrieval front, on the Christian grammar front, and all those sorts of things. And yet, there's a way in which I don't overly despair, even though we can be really dumb in America. Maybe this is my Calvary Chapel background, and like Calvary Chapel isn't known for
Calvary Chapel's. I think I knew this, but I re-remembered Calvary Chapel. I used to do crusades.
Oh yeah,
Calvary Chapel
exactly.
in Anaheim.
Yeah, but exactly. We went to as a baby. I think I was at the Mecca, the Costa Mesa Calvary Chapel. My goodness, yeah. But I am impressed with God's ability to just work the gospel through a really small little faithful saint. And one of the things that's really fascinating about reading about the history of philosophy as a way of life, like that survey I use in our course, is that you're able to see that so many of these schools, you go through Plato and Aristotle and then the Epicureans and Stoics and such, and what you see are scholia. These are schools with tutors and disciples, and there's practices they go through to try to orient themselves philosophically. But what's so fascinating is all of those schools, most of what ancient philosophy was after was getting rid of my anxiety, overcoming the fear of death, becoming this kind of well-ordered sort of above it all person, that sort of thing. There's exceptions to putting it that way. But the idea is you're supposed to achieve ultimately the conquering of the fear of death. That's the most philosophical spirit you can have. And yet, for all of their philosophy, they never produced that. I mean, it was very rare. And of course, they almost had to become a non-human to achieve it. But then, of course, Christ comes along, who is seen to be a philosopher. The Jews were also spoken of as a nation of philosophers by the philosophers. Jesus is seen as sort of a philosopher. Paul is traveling in philosophical schools. And what do the Christians produce? But non-well-born, largely low-born people who nevertheless overcome the fear of death. And so what philosophy is trying to get you, mom and pop, who actually don't know that much, nevertheless just have wisdom in self. And I think I guess I'd just say, like, I don't lose hope because that's always there, even though, of course, the church always valued the formal theological side of its life, of its mind. It's just the whole body of the church. Part of our body is a mind.
If I remember correctly, Athanasius, in his little book on the Incarnation, somewhere in Athanasius, if it's there or somewhere else, basically argues one thing that's unique about Christianity is we don't fear death. And it's why Christian martyrs exist, because the gospel delivers you from that fear of death. There's a book I read some time ago by Ernst Becker called The Fear of Death, The Denial of Death. And I'm not sure if it's like a really scholarly book or whatever, but his basic thesis is philosophy and life is essentially we all live from a fear of death perspective. That's why you try to gain reputation, why you try to last beyond yourself. It's essentially trying to overcome death. And one of the interesting things is, in Genesis chapter 2, you have the knowledge of good and evil. It's knowledge of what seems to be wisdom, the distinction between good and evil. In the Restoration, wisdom is actually eliminating the ability to choose evil by actually only choosing the good. So wisdom turns out to be not necessarily being able to distinguish for choice reasons good and evil, but to actually only naturally know the good, which is what Romans 12, end of Hebrews 4, end of Hebrews 5, actually I think is what it is, which talks about our maturity and growth by means of knowing good and evil through habits. But what I was getting at there is that once they eat of that tree and are exiled from God's presence, there's this history of fear, and this history of the fear of death that begins to take over. And you don't fully realize it until well, there's a first murder in chapter 4, but once you get to chapter 5, there's this seemingly boring genealogy in Genesis. Unless you pay a little close attention to the refrain, and he died, and he died, and he died, it goes on and on. And there's this real sense, even though these antediluvian characters have long lives, they're almost like these heroic figures. They die, just like anyone else. And there's much more you could say about this, but getting to Hebrews chapter 2, where the redemptive aspect of the incarnation is associated with overcoming the fear of death. And if part of the wisdom tradition, I think you're right on this, by the way, part of the wisdom tradition is a way of life to sort of overcome that fear of death. Not always explicitly, but often explicitly, actually.
Yeah.
Like in the Latin Stoics and others, there's an explicit, the anxiety over pain and pleasure is sometimes, pleasure is like eating and staving off. Pain would obviously be death type stuff often. But a lot of this is resolved through just trying to overcome death. And you said you become almost inhuman. Yeah, a lot of the prescriptions in early philosophy to overcome the fear of death does almost make you a computer or something like that.
Yeah. A dear friend of mine, Patrick Steffen, did his dissertation at UW Denver, Itliff School. I think it's Itliff, is what's called there, but published with Fortress, The Power of Resurrection. And he performs this, don't everybody get nervous, a sort of Foucauldian power analysis.
I'm really nervous.
Yeah. But effectively what he argues is that what you see in the early church is a kind of transition. And it's also a kind of why did the early church win story? A move from despotic to disciplinary power. Effectively what he argues is think of Caesar, and it's a very, very scholarly piece of work, has interesting implications for early Christian worship and architecture. But the basic idea is, what was it? Caesar's power, how does Caesar rule in the hearts of man? He rules through the fear of death. And so what is the symbol of the crucifixion that's all along the roads that you pass by? Yeah. It's an indication to you that Caesar, whose icon is everywhere, on the coins, his right. presence is everywhere. Caesar controls life and death. And he can put you up here and penetrate your body when he wants to, and there's nothing you can do about it. And then you think of the Colosseum. The Colosseum and this famous thing we love to see in movies, the thumbs up and thumbs down, right? Caesar has the right. power of clemency, and it's an icon of just this. He can control the life-death thing. Well, what happens when one man gets hung on the cross, the center of Caesar's power, and then he comes back out of the grave? And then his followers are so emboldened by that they're sitting inside of a Colosseum and they're unafraid of the lions who are going to eat them. And so what you see is these plebeians, in a sense, lose in a way, at least ostensibly. Oh, Wyatt, did you go away, brother?
No, I'm still here. Am I just frozen right now?
Oh yeah. I think it might just be for me and not the live stream.
No, sometimes that's how. I'm just going to reset my camera.
Oh, there you go.
Oh, maybe not.
We'll see what that. Well, the frozen chosen, they call them. But yeah, effectively, what he's trying to argue is that in the Colosseum, watching people unafraid of death undermines Caesar's power in such a fundamental way that, and then you see what he argues is that the church does is then develop these disciplinary structures, this liturgical life, this reordering of time around the theme of the resurrection to kind of keep that central, and it relativizes. And effectively what he argues is very organically then right. you're actually able to kind of spread throughout Rome and such. Well,
I'm still here. I don't know why my camera's being wonky right now, but I will try to fix that for, I guess, next time.
Next time.
Well, that is fascinating, and I'm distracted by my camera not working, but I guess that's why we're doing a test stream. I like that. I think that's good. I feel like we figured out how this works, and maybe we should close down our stream.
Yes.
Realizing that we had a good yarn.
Yeah.
And we'll figure out. I think the live stream technology we're using will allow us to plan live streams. We can do a little bit more work with it.
Yep.
And we can kind of go from there to see what we want to do. But I think tomorrow we're planning to do this on wisdom in light of Boethius and why it's practical for, I guess, 2025.
Let us know if you want us to address something. I'm sure we'll.
Yeah, in the comments, that'd be great. And we'll figure out the technology, make it better. I'll figure out why my camera's frozen. I have no good reason for that, to be honest. Oh, something just changed. Not for the better, however.
Yeah, it's getting worse.
It's getting worse. Anyhow, okay, I will hit stop and we will talk hopefully tomorrow.